to say that's a tough act to follow the entire week. I'm the last technical deep dive for the week. All right, I've got that figured out. So just out of curiosity, how many people actually work in Maritime or are familiar with Maritime in here? I can't actually see. There's a person right there. Okay. And OT Cyber, how many people actually work in OT Cyber in here? Probably most people. Any students, university students? I think this would be a great forum for university students. What I'm going to be talking about today is just what we've learned doing maritime cybersecurity assessments. Starting back in 2014, I did my first vessel assessment, and what we discovered was that there was a lot of flat networks, so we're going to talk about that, and a lot more computerized equipment than what the owners even realized. What the maritime owners and operators are actually doing in this space, what kind of questions they have. A couple of key systems, the cybersecurity events that we're worried about, usually that the owners are worried about, what the owners and the operators and the crews actually want out of cybersecurity, and then some of it, what's actually being put in place today in cybersecurity. And hopefully we have some time for some questions at the end. Most of you are probably actually familiar with this event. And if you aren't familiar with Maritime, if you just look at your person and look at the people around you, look at everything that you have on your person, about 80%, some people say 90% of all the goods in the world are shipped on the seas, or on the seas today, being transferred on the seas. Think about a massive supply chain. And this type of an event actually worries us more than anything. It's basically the maritime equivalent of like a colonial pipeline, if you think about it that way. An IT type event takes down all the screens, and then because of that, shipping doesn't work, you lose logistics. Their concern with this was actually that it could somehow make it to their load systems, their systems that are integrated with load planning and then ballasting of the ships. And so if you aren't familiar with this is a Maersk attack that happened a few years ago. This is a logistical supply chain attack that we're worried about in Maritime. This is the other one. A lot of people that I talk to in Maritime are actually worried about getting a GPS attack, whether their satellite signals go down, denial of service, that type of thing, or something actually occurs and their ship looks like it's in a different location. That could cause different things like groundings or collisions, the idea that they don't even know where their systems are, and also reporting and compliance. Every ship over a certain gross tonnage actually has to have an AIS, an automated identification system or two that explains to the world where the ship is at all times. You can see it. There was an evergreen issue that happened in the Middle East, and we saw it in the Suez Canal. You could see the patterns in the water. That's basically what the AIS is. So you can track almost every ship that's over 500 gross tons in the water. I'm going to explain why this is kind of a scare and a threat at this point, more than anything. But we're starting to notice a little bit of a trend here that I think it's really interesting to explain. And you've been through a lot of presentations, so you see things moving from IT to OT and the concern there. On this slide right here, we have the three of the largest shipping companies, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Costco, and Maersk. Those are three of the largest shipping companies in the world, and they've had cybersecurity incidents or events in the last 5 years. Ships also come into port, right? And ships go into dry docking and maintenance. We're also seeing that happen in Fincantieri, ransomware attack in Norway, U.S. port, ransomware attack. MSC, actually, their customer-facing system went down. But I do want to point out this issue with this MTSA, Maritime Transportation Safety Act port that occurred in the U.S. In that specific event, it was actually a ransomware event that spread from different government systems down into the network through a CCTV system and actually shut down the cargo and control system for the port. If you were following it at the time, you would have seen what the port was, and then now it's almost difficult to find out what that port was. It's all been scrubbed because it's actually a legal issue, a liability issue. That specific incident was an older version of what we think turned into Conti, Ryuk ransomware. It's a very real issue, and if something was actually connected to that port at the time, it could have spread into the vessels. So those are things that we want to talk about. So let's look at an asset. This, if you're not familiar with maritime, this is basically an oil tanker or a very large crude cargo ship. All of these systems on the ship are actually interconnected, mostly with Ethernet. A lot of the navigation bridge uses serial connectivity, and in between the systems, they'll either have copper or fiber Ethernet, or they'll actually have those serial type connections. The key systems that we're looking at on a vessel, just so you're familiar with this, because if you're familiar with a plant or power production facility or substations, or you're familiar with oil and gas, refineries, and all that kind of stuff, you might think things that are in engineering are more critical. But we want to actually focus on the key things that are important to a ship: the location of the ship, the safety and welfare of the ship, the navigation bridge, these systems that actually locate the ship, and sometimes they automatically locate the ship. Those are really key systems. In this specific ship, a lot of these systems are integrated by an integrated automation and control system, and I'll show you what that looks like in just a little bit. And from that integrated automation and control system, you can control and view things like the engine control systems, cargo control, so a lot of RF, wireless tank level sensors and things like that. Also, when you come into port or when you're offloading, there's connectivities back to that terminal. And so it's really key to see where all these connections actually take place. On the vessels, we actually see where there's usually a business IT network, a crew welfare network, and a lot of times when we actually look at a vessel and do an assessment, they don't have the best practices in place. They look at it like it's a machine, like this could be a water going or seafaring semi truck for all intents and purposes, but it's not. This specific vessel is probably 300 meters long. That's how long. It's multiple stories. 10 stories. This one here is probably like 6 stories. This is what that automated system looks like. Let me see if I can actually point this. Yeah. These systems right here, these are in boxes or cabinets. Underneath these are in these fields. These are field stations. And a lot of times what you'll see is in these terminals here, it's basically just a computer with a hardened specialized cabinet or console, and multiples of those. This is the engine control room, cargo control. We have an engine control system. We have power management. Some vessels that we actually work on, they have an electromechanical drive. The engine actually just generates power, and the propulsion is a huge electric engine. It looks like it takes up a warehouse. It's amazing to look at. And all of that's controlled by these control panels here, and it goes through these field stations. Usually there's some kind of a redundant network, and a lot of it's Ethernet, fiber, copper Ethernet. There is some separation, but not always. This system here, this is like the black box voyage data recorder, and then you'll notice here, and this is a generalized version of an actual system overview from an actual OEM type of a system. This is actually the remote access that connects back to the business network, into this network. And in most cases, there might be a combo firewall router right there, but not always. And that way, all this is interconnected. And on this specific type of a vessel, you'll see that this system here controls the thrusters. Thrusters are what are used to make the ship go side to side, turn on a dime essentially, and then the main engines which make it go forward or backward. And things like power, switchboard, voltage conversions, up and down conversions, AC to DC. They're big DC engines, cargo control, and so on. Now, this is a system that's leading us to autonomous vessels. This is called a dynamic positioning system. In a dynamic positioning system, it's used in offshore supply vessels. In a lot of cases, this system is actually designed, this system's actually designed to maintain station keeping next to a platform. And so it needs to have at least 3 positional references. One down to the sea floor, that's a hydroacoustic, and then some laser and GPS. GPS is not the only way that it keeps station keeping. And then there's some other ways to do it. Now, most of these systems, and it's required by the Coast Guard in the Gulf of Mexico, most of these types of systems are redundant, so they call it a DP2 system. So if something fails hardware-wise, it'll actually recover to the other system, and you won't lose just a hardware component and lose all the functionality and have a collision. But the network separation doesn't exist. So this system will be connected to a mirrored SIM. It's exactly the same. There's no cybersecurity. I like to point out that there's something that looks like an old school brass knob mechanism here on the bridge, and then in that same space right below, there's PLCs. So when you look at it, you see like these brass knobs, and it looks very mechanical, electromechanical, but it's all computer controlled. That's basically how this system works. On some vessels, like the big drilling platforms we've seen, they'll have what's kind of a version of this. They call it like a DP1, doesn't have redundancy, and they use that to control the vessel. The thrusters, and they can turn on a dime. It's amazing. But that system right there, if it's compromised, it could cause a collision. This vessel right here is probably 300 feet long. It can cause hundreds of thousands of dollars of damage. And this is the kind of the old version of what a military ranking system looks like. And this is what's on ships. This is how it works. You have the master, who's literally internationally known as the master. That's the captain of the vessel. And then you have a deck crew, which manages like the navigation bridge, engineering staff. It's all the piping, engines, and things like that. And then they report up through, and this is what that staff looks like. In most cases, these people aren't really used to cyber. If an event actually occurred, they probably wouldn't even know that it's related to cyber. So you're not really going to train them a lot. It's multi-generational. You have people that started as a deckhand or a seaman, and then they work their way up through the ranks, or their family was always, deckhands, and that's all they do. Some people get licensed and they make their way up to where they're, seconds and first mates and so on. But they do all of these different things. So in engineering, you've got fueling, bunkering, water maker, potable water, and that kind of thing. You've got a steward. Sometimes the steward doesn't, this master steward, this steward here, doesn't actually exist. They just report to the deck crew. Cooking, catering, all that kind of stuff. Think of this as like a floating office building because there's HVAC and multiple decks, and you have to take care of crew welfare. So let's talk about the regulation. You can just look at this slide backwards, right? Because a lot of the pressure is actually put on shipyards whenever they're doing dry docking and repairs, or vessel repairs, and the owners and the operators. But all of these people over here are influencing cybersecurity in maritime right now. The only problem is all of these people right here are looking to the owners and operators as well and saying, well, what can you do regulatory-wise? What are you actually doing to upgrade your systems? Charters are saying, what are you doing with your ships to make sure that they're cybersecurity compliant? There's a lot of different pressures on the owners and operators, and then they're looking at the shipyards to do upgrades and updates and build new systems that are cyber safe and so on. So I just wanted to point that out. You'll notice there's a lot of different standards, and in maritime, what we've looked at is we've looked at ships that do they carry cargo, they do liquids and petroleum products, but also some of these vessels are drilling ships and are people carriers and military ships. We look at military ships that do underway replenishment. So a lot of these standards actually apply, and what we found is through all of these standards, the maritime ones specifically, I'm going to look at it in just a second. All of these standards, really, these are the keys. Knowing what your assets are and doing some kind of a risk assessment to prioritize the asset. On ships, you have a safety management system. It's all risk-based for safety, and so the key to that is knowing what your primary essential services are. Vulnerability management, so we'll see the U.S. Coast Guard looks at vulnerability management. They have a maritime transportation safety administration or security administration, and they actually look at, are you looking at the vulnerabilities in your regulated facilities, and can you detect or respond to a cybersecurity incident? Since they focus on these, a lot of confusion is caused by the extra standards because there's so much more to do in security other than just these things. So it becomes very compounding and very complicated. And these are the key maritime kind of regulations and standards. The first one happened, International Maritime Organization. This started getting released in 2000, or clarified in 2017, 2016. And they said you have to have cybersecurity risk management in your safety management systems before you do your documented compliance or your review, your annual audit in 2021, January 2021. But they put all the pressure on the flag states, the flag of the ship, the flag states to either write the requirements for what cybersecurity looks like, or they put it on the classification societies that write the rules, or they actually put it on the owners and the operators to define what that cybersecurity requirement was. They did put some guidance out. So this MSC FAL, that actually has guidance. And what's really interesting about that is it's an international guideline, but it actually references the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's where I noticed pretty quickly that the cybersecurity framework seems to have more of a global impact than maybe even what NIST realized. This organization here, BIMCO, they put out guidelines. They're on the 4th version. They might be working on the 5th version if it hasn't already been released. The difference between 3 and 4 was that in 4, they released it shortly after this actually went into effect. The IMO went into effect. And in that guideline, they actually added things like you should be able to monitor and detect a cybersecurity incident. And what's really interesting about that is they said the crews should be able to integrate this into their routine maintenance or routine procedures. So they're looking for cybersecurity incidents. No technologies involved, just, hey, if you see a cybersecurity incident, you have to be able to respond to it. So that adds some interesting problems that you have to solve. And then the U.S. Coast Guard said that any vessel that enters near our ports, our coastal waters, will get inspected against this work instruction. And in this specific work instruction, it says, look at IMO 42898. It says you have to have cybersecurity risk management on your ship. You have to have a way to respond to cybersecurity incidents, and you have to prove that. Or you could be detained, or you could be delayed or denied entry in the future. And so this is actually where we're seeing some stronger requirements just because. Now, working with the Coast Guard, they're still trying to learn exactly how to do that inspection, how to actually look at that and talk to the crews and get the clear answers for that. So it's not strong. The idea or the concept here is it's not too strong. So what the shipping companies actually want to do is they want to go back and say, well, what can I do on my ship in a way that I don't actually have to modify anything, but I can detect a cybersecurity incident and meet these routine monitoring requirements. And they're looking for ways to actually just monitor that. Now, there's some considerations for monitoring the vessels. The other part of it is the crews. So standard reporting structures. So if there's a cybersecurity incident, every plan that I've seen has the ship captain as a cybersecurity officer on the ship. So now the ship captain, who took care of everything else, including HR on the ship or human resources, is now the cybersecurity incident coordinator on the vessel. I thought at first it was going to be the chief engineer doing that because I assumed that these were more kind of OT cybersecurity scary, and maybe even the chief officer and the deck crew because there's cargo equipment and there's navigation bridge. But every organization that I've worked with just made the ship captain the cybersecurity incident response coordinator. And then they report it back up. So they have to report from the ship back to their office. And most most companies have a ship management or fleet management organization. And within that fleet management organization, they might have a cybersecurity officer. Now, the only issue here is in reporting, sometimes you don't have communications. So at some point, it turns into a transportation security incident, and it might actually need to be reported. Definitely, if it's near the U.S., to the Coast Guard. There's a technical team. This is when they're supposed to loop in like their OEMs and their coordinators there, and then it goes back to corporate. So by the time it gets back to corporate and gets back to the IT IR team and people who can actually respond to a cybersecurity incident, something bad's probably already happened on that ship. So it's still a little bit of a clunky process, but this is kind of how they're doing it today in shipping. Now, some shipping companies are starting to install devices that actually do the passive IDS. They actually do the passive monitoring. And in doing that, this is what I've discovered is the best way to do it. So we'll actually install it on a control network or a bridge network or both. Sometimes when you have the integrated automation and control system, you can install it on those multiple networks. And then there has to be some kind of a console on the ship. It doesn't have to be a heavyweight console. It doesn't really have to cost a lot. It could use something that's homegrown, like an Elastic or something that can just consolidate all the logs. But it has to be really easy for the crew to operate. It has to monitor the connections. It has to triage and prioritize the alerts based off of a preset set of conditions. And then it also has to be able to alert the crew. So if they look at that, they can say, okay, communication to the VSAT's down, fleet broadband's down, but you have these alerts that just popped up, in which case they can make a phone call or make a different type of communication. And then the actual fleet managers or the IT staff or whoever's monitoring it wants some kind of a client interface so that they can see the status of their entire fleet. And like I've said here on the right, it requires the right technologies here, which we've seen some of those at this event. And then it also requires the right kind of integration here and using some kind of technology that monitors the bandwidth and limits the amount of bandwidth, because our VSAT providers, or some of them are telecom providers, and they charge based off the bandwidth. So, and this is what Maritime expects. They expect coverage over the entire fleet. They want the entire thing managed. They want it priced per ship, let's say, but they want it per ship. They want secure transmission, completely passive, low bandwidth. And this is a big, let's say, a big bill to fill, making sure all of that's done. Now, where we want to get is we actually want to get to where there's a lot of industry collaboration. This is what we're working on right now. This is where we want to get. We work with universities, and we work with the OEMs where we can, and we work with the owners and the operators. And where we want to get to is we want our technical information that's coming in. We want the information from outside sources, additional logs, everything integrated together, whether it's the technology and their threat intelligence groups or actual threat intelligence groups, and universities who are doing cyber ship labs and things like that. University of Plymouth is one of them, all to be integrated together and give us a single pane of glass so that we know what's happening to that entire surface, which was the 80% to 90% of all of our goods that are on the waterways. So basically, the focus here was, visibility of everything that's going on in the fleet. There's a lot of updates, digital updates to ships, monitoring ships, and things of that nature. But it should also include cybersecurity, some kind of updated security. So our threat intelligence feeds, understanding updates to vulnerabilities and things that change with regards to OEM systems, and then ultimately controlling all of that to give us control of that environment. I have a couple of minutes, and we can go into some questions here, if anybody has any questions.
Hi. So you talked about, these ships want to know if there is a cybersecurity incident on board or a cyber attack or something like that. But what happens if they find one? What do their response and recovery plans look like? Do they just turn everything off and sit and float in the ocean until somebody comes to help them?
Yeah. I have a two-part answer for that. So it is happening, and a lot of times it's not getting released. It's happening to companies that, let's say that they have very sensitive public affairs office, and when it does happen, it's usually on the IT side actually. So they'll catch it on the IT side, and they get really upset about it. They don't have strong incident response processes. And that's just carte blanche. That's what I see in the industry. They just don't have. They do have strong incident response processes. If there's a physical or a safety issue, they know how to handle that. So if it does translate to that, they can usually handle it pretty well. And the sensitive area there is actually working with them to update their existing procedures and plans. The other part of it is if a ship comes into our waterways and there's a steering failure, we know how to handle that. We know, okay, it's a steering failure, don't come any closer, shut things down, wait for us, the Coast Guard will go out. If it's cybersecurity, they have no idea. We don't know what that, you said there's a cybersecurity incident? What is that? We have no idea the scale of that. And so that's kind of the issue right now. The incident response plans are kind of weak when it comes to cyber. But typically, safety-wise, they already have it covered. Yeah. Oh. Yes, sir.
Just wondering if you see that IMO is going to move towards really creating more standards. The sort of write-it-yourself approach has really not resulted in much. Someone I was just talking to the other day, basically, they had the attitude that if we write into our plan that we are addressing cybersecurity, we have satisfied the requirement, and they have.
Yeah.
Which is pretty terrible at this stage.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So, I mean, this is a 300-year-old industry. There's a lot of competition. It's heavily inundated with different influencers, and so I don't know. I mean, I don't. How would you know if the IMO is going to put out a standard? The Titanic started safety of life at sea in 1912. Safety of life at sea became a requirement in the late 90s.
I think it will be the key because most of these folks, the margins are so tight on a lot of what they do that, asking them to spend $50 a day to mitigate an $80,000 a day risk of the vessel being down, they'll still balk at that, despite how crazy that sounds, because their competitor isn't doing it. Now they have a $50 edge.
Yeah.
And if they're just all required to do it, then everything costs a few pennies more and the problem's solved. And that's really where it has to go.
Yeah, I would say that's a good statement.
Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Hey, nice talk.
Thank you.
Looking at responsibilities for who does what, do you think that cybersecurity and information security disciplines are something that will have to be spread across different roles in a maritime environment, across different engineering, safety, and other roles? Something that maybe there should be a dedicated security officer on board? Or do you think with the advances of technology, we're at a point where we can comfortably onshore that capability to remote monitoring and analysis to put at the hands in so-called experts that can be more easily scaled up across multiple platforms?
You can absolutely onshore it. Larger companies that have fleets, 800 or so ships, they're doing that in-house now. They're trying to figure out how to do that. But yeah, it could absolutely be remotely monitored. Yeah.
Okay.
And managed in that way. I think the tolerance for it is price sensitivity. It's not capability.
Okay.
I'm actually out of time, but I'll take another question. I'm the last one, so.
All right, thanks. You mentioned working with OEMs. One of the things that I've seen is some maritime OEMs are, if you're an ICS or OT security person coming in, you maybe have experience, but they don't care about that. Do you have any advice for kind of breaking in with the maritime OT OEMs if you do have that kind of experience, but haven't necessarily, they sometimes have gatekeepers there?
Are you trying to get a job with an OEM?
No, I've worked for a couple different vendors in the network security monitoring space, and just seen that over the last few years.
I mean, in my experience, I've seen where the OEMs have a lot of control over their systems, and when you want to monitor a system, you can't come at it from the perspective that you want to monitor their system. Their clients have to say this needs to be done, and then they have to figure out a way to do it, essentially. And if the client pays for it too, it makes it easier. But yeah, that's basically it's who's, I don't know, writing the checks maybe. Yeah.
Thanks.
I am out of time, I think. Yep. Okay. Well, thank you. And